Okay.
All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome. We'll wait a couple minutes
Yeah. No,
to
I'm not.
allow everyone to join us. All right. I'll go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Cassandra Grilling Perez, Partner Experience Manager at Televero Behavioral Health. Joining me today are our National Partnerships Director, Elisa Pedersen, Derek Townsend, who is our parent specialist in the Dallas area, and Dr. Seth McGowan, a distinguished child and adolescent psychiatrist who will be leading today's presentation. We are thrilled to welcome you to our second installment of our Counselor Care webinar series, School Counselors on the Front Lines of Youth Mental Health. The term front lines truly reflects the critical role you play in supporting the well being of our youth. We're honored to offer insights and resources to help professionals like you who dedicate your careers to making a difference. Thank you for spending your valuable time with us, and we hope you'll leave with practical strategies and insights to make your challenging work a little easier. Before we dive in, here are a few quick notes. The webinar will run about 30 minutes, followed by a 15-minute Q&A session. If you have any questions during the session, please enter them in the Q&A section that's not in the chat, but you'll find a Q&A button at the top of your screen. Some questions were submitted during registration, and Dr. McGowan will address those as possible. If we don't get to your question, don't worry. We'll follow up with you after the webinar to ensure you get all of the answers you need. And a recording of the webinar will be emailed to you once it's available. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Seth McGowan, who leads our child and adolescent pod at Televero Behavioral Health. Dr. McGowan has an impressive academic and clinical background. He earned his medical degree at the University of Rochester, graduating at the top of his class, and completed his adult and child psychiatry training at Columbia University, where he continues to serve on the clinical faculty. Dr. McGowan is deeply committed to using minimal medication and crafting personalized therapeutic approaches to meet each student's unique needs. Please join me in welcoming Dr. McGowan.
Thank you so much, Cassandra. I'm very excited to be here today. And, particularly these talks to you educators and school psychologists and counselors really hit home for me because while I'm a doctor now, I actually come from a family of educators. My mom was a teacher, my dad was a guidance counselor, and my wife is a teacher. So I really appreciate all you guys do, and especially with COVID and post-COVID, all of the issues that you guys have had to deal with. So today I really wanted to focus on the issue of working with kids on the spectrum. And really with three kind of clear learning objectives. First is to help you guys be able to identify students who are showing signs that they could be on the spectrum and hopefully helping you to differentiate that from other diagnoses like anxiety and OCD and things like that. Second is learning how to work with families, if you identify these kids, to help them find and get the appropriate services that they need for their children. And finally, third, trying to give you some ideas about developing programs and supports that you guys can use in your schools to help these students achieve their potential and create those social connections. So the whole idea of autism has really certainly changed dramatically in my lifetime, right? As a kid growing up in mostly in the 70s, I was born in 64. When I was a little kid, autism was really only thought of in what we would now think of as really profoundly autistic kids, who had no language at all when they're 3, 4, 5 years of old, often with severe cognitive issues and everything. And it was really during the 1970s that began to shift a little bit with DSM, which came up with the idea at that point of what they called infantile autism, right? Which basically had criteria that the symptoms had to be evident before 30 months of age, right? Because for any kids on the spectrum, we understand that as a lifelong illness, right? So it's something they're born with. So you see symptoms going back to before they're 30 months of age, that they're having qualitative impairment in social interaction, communication, and imaginative play, that they often lack the speech or they failure to engage in simple conversation, that they have a difficulty, right, with social interactions, including a lack of social or emotional reciprocity, and a lack of shared enjoyment or interest with others. And finally, many kids on the spectrum can exhibit kind of repetitive stereotype behaviors like rocking and spinning, or stereotype, interests or activities that they often do. Coming out of that from the 1970s, that approach to thinking about autism really began the process of understanding that these issues of difficulty with social interaction are actually seen in other children who may be much more functional. And so kind of through the 70s and 80s into the 90s, there was an increasing look and understanding about children who had milder symptoms, right? And what we call kind of higher functioning, autistic individuals. And that initially led to a diagnosis called Asperger's disorder that you guys may know, although it no longer exists, right? That diagnosis actually became official back in 1992 in DSM-4. But then as the understanding of autism continued to grow and it began to be thought of more of an ongoing spectrum, they actually ended up retiring the diagnosis of autism in 2013 in DSM-5, and they folded everything into what now we know and call a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder, right? And so this covers individuals from way back in the 70s, really those really functionally impaired individuals, all the way up to very, very high functioning individuals, but who all share those kind of core issues that we see. And one of the big ones, right, that you always want to keep an eye on is that idea of really missing social cues and social interactions. And as Temple Grandin, who we'll talk about at the end, said, she's a very bright PhD on the spectrum, she really expressed that for her, social language and social interaction was really a foreign language, right? And I think that can be a really useful thing to keep in mind when you're thinking about kids on the spectrum, that for them, all of these nonverbal social cues and social interactions that we take, for granted really is a foreign language for them, and they really don't understand it. So in terms of those higher functioning kids, and these are going to be many of the kids that you guys are going to be seeing in the school, right? These are kids that may have, average or above average intelligence. They, for the most part, may have normal language development, but they're still showing those key features of difficulty with social interaction, communication, repetitive or unusual interests without recognizing that others don't share the same interests, right? So that's the kid who's just totally focused on trains and he wants to talk to every other kid in the class about trains, and he misses the fact that the other kids don't really care or not that interested in trains, right? But given that these kids tend to be, higher functioning, they're often misdiagnosed, right? Because there's a lot of overlap, if we think about it, with things like anxiety, right? So you can have a socially anxious child who struggles socially, but they understand social cues, they're just nervous and anxious. Or, individuals with OCD who can be kind of rigid. And these are all things that kind of overlap with kids on the spectrum. And often you'll see kids in the schools who come in sometimes misdiagnosed with those things because either the provider or the situation hasn't allowed for them to recognize that this child really doesn't understand social cues. And that's where you guys in the school come in, because often that's the first place that those kids are facing those challenges. Right? So making a proper diagnosis obviously requires a detailed development to history and a parallel history. Now, obviously, you guys in the schools don't really have maybe the time and resources to do that, but what I'm hoping to do is at least give you a little window into it So maybe you can be picking up on some of this because again, you guys really are the front line. And a lot of times you're going to maybe be the one who's going to have to say to a parent, hey, I know you think your child has anxiety and they do seem anxious, but we're noticing in a school that maybe there's other things going on, right? And that can be where you can really play a very valuable role in helping. Um, and finally, obviously, it's a lifelong disorder. So to be diagnosed, it really has that have that lifelong history of symptoms, right? Which can help you differentiate it also from other diagnoses. So how do we distinguish between kids on a spectrum and other psychiatric diagnosis? As I was saying before, there can be a lot of overlap between students on the spectrum and other psychiatric issues, especially anxiety, OCD, and even ADHD. Some of the clues that you might want to look for is that often kids on the spectrum will avoid eye contact, right? They'll almost be uncomfortable making eye contact. So they'll be looking down, looking to the side, even when they're talking to you. Like we were saying before, they'll seem to be missing social cues from their peers. So they'll be playing or they'll be around other kids and you realize, wow, they're not getting what all the other kids are getting in terms of those social cues, right? Often too, as I was saying before, they'll have the tendency to have their own specific interests and they'll just want to be talking about those things that they're really interested in. And they don't recognize that their peers aren't interested in it and their peers get bored. Another big issue you'll see with kids on the spectrum, and this certainly shows itself in the school where there's lots of transitions between things, kids on the spectrum often have a lot of difficulty with those transitions. And when, especially if there's a change in routine, right? So like normally on a normal day, everyone goes here at fourth period, but now because of something else, it got changed. Those sorts of things can lead kids on the spectrum to get very upset and even some outbursts, right? So changes in routine can be very difficult for them. And we'll talk about how to deal with that a little later in the talk. Okay, so now we maybe have identified some kids who, wow, we're seeing things in the school that are making us think maybe this child does have some issues that might be on the spectrum. They really have some issues with socialization and social cues. So what do we want to do? Obviously, we want to be trying to involve and talk with the parents. And again, since you guys in the school are often the first place that children confront these kind of social skills in larger peer groups, you're often going to be the first ones to really see and notice that those are the core issues that they're struggling with, right? Like I was saying before, these might have been kids that got diagnosed as being anxious before they were really starting school, but now that they're having to do all these social interactions, right, you're picking up on that. The other thing often you'll see is there is a lot of comorbidity with learning issues, right? So for kids on the spectrum, you'll often find these are kids who are struggling academically and have some issues on the spectrum. When we're meeting with parents, right, what we really want to do is focus on a couple of things. First, on the importance of early intervention, saying, look, we've noticed this in your child now, but don't worry, right? If we get them connected to the right supports and stuff now, there's no reason that your child can't, be very successful, right? So really focusing on those positive things that you see with the student, the fact that early intervention, there's no reason they won't succeed. Those are really obviously important things to try to be conveying to the parents. The other thing, obviously, is having the parents not rely on you guys as school to do everything, right? And really suggesting to them with those students that maybe they try to get their children involved in clubs or groups outside of school that can help aid in kind of social skills and social skills training, and maybe for certain kids, even getting into social skills groups and things like that, right? Those can be very useful and important things to think about and to suggest to parents that can be helpful. Now, the school, right? As we were saying, if you have a child on a spectrum and their kind of core issue is that social interactions and nonverbal social cues are a foreign language to them, school can be really scary. And they've got to learn all of a sudden to navigate all these social interactions. And like I was saying, that's really a foreign language to them, right? And in addition to that, obviously, kids are very perceptive. And so their peers are going to notice that they're different. And that can really put students on a spectrum, as kind of prime targets for bullying, right? Which is something we've got to be very aware of and watching out for. Because, other peers will be like, oh, that kid's weird, they don't get this or whatever, right? So they can really be the targets for bullying, which can really be an issue. So all of this leaves you guys in this very challenging position of needing to make these students on the spectrum feel comfortable in an environment that's about as uncomfortable as it could be for them. Um, how do we make them feel comfortable? Uh, so the key to making them feel comfortable is really focusing on a few things, right? First of all, as I was saying before, students who are on the spectrum struggle mightily with change, right? Which means whenever there's any kind of change in the schedule or there's new events or a speaker's coming in or whatever, it becomes important to really try to give those students as much advance notice as possible, right? So they're aware and prepare themselves, right? So if you as the teacher or as a guidance counselor, whatever, know that there's going to be a speaker coming to the school or something's going to change for a day, right? Giving that student heads up a day or two in advance and helping prepare them for it can be really, really valuable. The other thing is the students on the spectrum often think in very concrete ways. And that's important to remember because that can lead to frequent misunderstanding, right? Where these students are feeling that they're being lied to, right? Because the circumstances changed from what they was expected, right? So the student's like, no, you told me that we were, this happens at 2 o'clock every day. And so now the fact that it's not happening at 2 o'clock, that student gets very upset because they feel like they're being lied to, right? Which again comes back to trying to prepare them as much as possible for change and really keeping that in mind. I had a very high functioning autistic individual I worked with who, he described most of people, he thought that most of people were very hypocritical. Why? Because he was always focusing on exactly what they said. And then if it didn't quite meet that exact thing, oh, they were being hypocritical about it, right? So recognizing that these kids on the spectrum, again, it's not that they're trying to be oppositional or anything like that, but for them, they see things very concretely. And if you said A and it, because of things that happened, it changed to B, they think they're lied to. It's hard for them to understand it. No, you didn't understand. You didn't know that things were going to change, right? So that's a real important thing to try to help them with. Also, right, recognizing just for you to know, right, that these students, they often feel themselves very alone and isolated because just as their peers notice that they're different, especially the higher functioning kids on the spectrum can be very self-aware and they can recognize that they're just not getting things and that they're different in that sense from their peers. Okay, so what do we do in the classroom? One thing is to try to make sure you're seating these students, who are on the spectrum near the front of the classroom, because that obviously can help them stay engaged with the teacher. It can also help hopefully limit bullying from other students, right? Because if they're in the back corner, maybe it's going to be easy for students to say things to them or pick on them. And so trying to have them sit kind of more up front, and engage with the teacher can be really helpful. Whenever you're talking to them individually, as I was saying before, trying to keep that language very concrete, right? So really avoiding kind of abstract concepts and things and really laying things out in a very linear and concrete way can be really helpful in getting their understanding. Another thing that can be very helpful is using visual aids and visual schedules to help them plan and understand what's coming next, right? Kids on the spectrum often do better with pictures and visual things than they do with kind of hearing it said to them, right? So whenever you're able to kind of have visual supports or visual cues when you're working with them, that can be really, really helpful. Another huge one, getting back to that change thing, is establishing routines, right? In as much as you can, trying to have these kids on a regular, repeatable routine really, really helps a lot, right? Because then again, there's less transition, there's less change, they get used to that schedule, they expect that routine, and that can be really, really helpful. When things are going to change, again, taking those few minutes beforehand to help prepare them for the transitions, right? So saying, hey, the whole class may do something and they're all fine with it, but with these students on a spectrum, 10 or 15 minutes before, you want to go up to that student and let them know, hey, in 10 minutes, we're going to be moving on to this, right? And giving them that heads up and advance notice to kind of smooth and ease that transition can make a real, real big difference for them. As I was saying before, kids on the spectrum, sometimes have real special interests. And especially for the brighter kids on the spectrum, sometimes they know a ton about these things and they're very well versed in these things. So whenever possible in the schools, if you can incorporate some of their special interests into their projects or things like that, that can help a lot. And it can even help with their peers, right? Because then they can maybe in the class be doing a class discussion about their thing that they're really interested in and pull in some of their peers to that. So that can be really, really helpful. The other thing, and my wife's a teacher, so she's always drumming this into my head, using a multi-sensory teaching whenever possible with these kids really, really helps. Because again, these kids struggle a lot of times with just hearing it out of someone's mouth. So if you have multi-sensory things where they're using their hands, or you have visual things or other kinds of things too, that can really be a big benefit for them and help them a lot. One thing to think about in the schools, right, in terms of outside the classroom, that can be very useful both for these students and for their peers in helping them to get to know these students, can be the idea of having a lunch bunch. Now, some of your schools may already have a lunch bunch, I don't know, but that can be a really good thing to kind of institute, right? And the idea with a lunch bunch is you want to keep it small, right? 4 to 10 kids, and I would say, if anything, on the smaller end of that. Definitely consider choosing other students as role models to be part of the group, right? Because one, that can help the kids on the spectrum, right? Because they've got kids who aren't on the spectrum in a lunch bunch who they can be watching how they interact. Two, obviously, it can help a lot in maybe creating friendships or connections between kids on the spectrum and the other kids in the school, right? So if you can, right, trying to pull some kids in as role models can be really helpful. Right. And when we're working with these kids, right, we want to really be working on positively reinforcing things, right, and be very clear, right? So, if a child is doing something the right way or whatever, right, saying, hey, John, I love the way that you did X, and being very clear on what they're doing and how you like it, right? Along with that is trying to avoid focusing on the negative behaviors, right? We as people all do better with positive reinforcement, right? You guys at your jobs do a lot better if you're working toward getting a bonus than if you're worried that you're going to get fired, right? And it's the same thing here, right? We want to try to be focused on the positive. So trying to avoid focusing on the negative behaviors whenever possible. A good rule of thumb is to try to aim to have at least 4 positive reinforcements you're giving for every negative correction you're giving, right? So trying to stay on that positive side of the spectrum is really, really helpful. Obviously, definitely make sure to get the parent permission from all the students, including the role models who you're going to have in a lunch bunch. And obviously, a parent-teacher conference can be a great time to have those discussions. And for the kids and role models, right, suggesting those parents, hey, your child is a really helpful child, whatever. We're going to be starting this lunch bunch for some kids who struggle with things. We'd love it if we could have, Johnny join that group, right? And that can be helpful. And parents then can sometimes feel really good, right, that their kid has been chosen for that. And really for all the kids in the group, right, really reinforcing to them that this club is a fun, positive activity, right? And so this is a fun thing to do. This is not something you have to do or there's something wrong. This is a lunch bunch. It's a group to get together, talk, and kind of all have fun together. And, and that can be a really good thing if you're able to bring into your schools. Educating parents, right? So as we're doing this, we want to try to kind of keep that communication open with the parents. And that could be good for us in the schools and for the parents with their kids at home, right? So trying to have frequent contact with the parents, sorry, of children on the spectrum helps them both at home and at school, right? You want to understand and explore with the parents what they're seeing are triggers, right? As well as what they see the student use to calm themselves at home, right? Because if we can understand what are the triggers at home and what the students use to calm themselves at home, we can kind of hopefully incorporate that into schools and learn okay, wait, that may be a trigger for them or whatever. And we want to give that same information back to the parents, right? What are the things we're seeing kind of trigger them at school and how we're working and how we're calming them at school. Just as I was saying to you guys before, really try to reinforce with parents that to try to use positive reinforcement as their primary tool when they're working with their kids. And then finally, obviously, if you guys in the school are seeing that there are real learning issues with these kids, suggesting to the parents that they get neuropsych testing, or if some of your districts offer, the testing, right? That we get that testing so that we can uncover if there are any comorbid learning issues, so we can make sure that we can address those issues as well. Finishing up a few minutes early, but I really did want to allow time for all of your questions. So are there some questions we have? Hello? Hi.
Mr. McGowan, we do have a couple questions that were submitted.
Okay.
The first one, how do factors such as race, gender, and socioeconomic background affect the experiences of individuals with autism?
Okay. Well, that's a tricky question, right? Certainly, right, race, gender, any of those things aren't going to, predispose someone to be on the spectrum. But I mean, I think the biggest issue for them gets back to the issue of socialization and social connections, right? So if I'm, let's say, a race that's already in the minority in my school, or I'm a girl on the spectrum and there's a lot more boys in my class, right? Anything that's going to be making those kids different from their peers is probably going to kind of make it a little bit more difficult and a little bit more challenging for them, right? So again, it's really about just understanding that individual student and where they're coming from in terms of their race, their ethnicity, their gender, all of that, and working to kind of help them then socialize with their peers better.
We have another question from Gabriella. What
Okay.
are the best tools for diagnosing at the teen or age?
The best tools for diagnosing the teen, you said, are what?
What are the best tools for diagnosing at teen or adult ages?
Okay. All right. So that's a great question, right? Because as I was saying before, we can certainly have situations, especially with individuals who are higher functioning, who are misdiagnosed when they're younger, right? So really teens and early adult, right? If they've never been diagnosed before, it gets back to what I was saying before, right? That we want to understand for them and listen to them as to whether what their core issue is really are issues with kind of understanding social cues, socialization, things like that. Again, right, if they seem to have real rigidity to them, that they're misunderstanding things a lot because they take everything exactly literally and they can't see, the shades of gray and things, right? So individuals on the spectrum, getting back to what we were talking before, right, struggle with that a lot, right? So those would be the kind of little flags, right, that might suggest to me if I was, let's say, seeing an adolescent or an adult for the first time and wondering if they're on the spectrum, if I saw those kinds of things, that would be the first step. And then the second step, going back to what I was saying before about it being a lifelong diagnosis, I would then need to go back through their history to see, has that been going on for their entire life, right? Where did they show signs, as preschoolers in an early elementary school or what have you, that there were these kind of struggles that would meet with that, right? Because again, if they're on the spectrum, even if I'm not diagnosing them until they're an adolescent or an adult, those things will, in the history, will go back, quite some time.
All right, thank you, Gabriella, for that question. Next, we have what advances in autism research are you most excited about?
I think for me, what I would say I'm most excited about is really the shift toward, like I said, when I was a kid in the 1970s, as just these profoundly autistic kids being this completely separate thing from everybody else, this understanding that really what we're dealing with here is more of a real spectrum, right, that can run across all individuals, with that key piece being that idea that almost socialization is a foreign language, right? Because the better we get at understanding that and working with these individuals, the better we get at learning how we can help them. And when we're done with these question and answer, I'll be playing a 2 or 3 minute talk from that I think you'll all find very interesting from someone, who's a very, very bright person on the spectrum. Are there other questions?
The last question is, what can the general public do to be more proactive in understanding and accepting autism?
What can we do to be more
Can
understanding
the
and proactive
general
in the
public do
general public? In
to
the
be
general
more
public.
proactive
Well,
in
I
understanding?
mean, I think a lot of it has to do with educating people, right? Again, educating the general public to the idea, hey, that individuals on the spectrum are really no different from you and me, except that for them, they have, if you want to even think of it as it's not really a learning disorder, right? But they have just this deficit where social interactions are kind of a foreign language to them, right? But aside from that, right? They're very much like you and I, and the better we get and understand that as in the general population, I think the easier and the better we'll get at being able to work and understand them, right? Because if you think about it as a foreign language, look, if I'm going to speak with somebody who only speaks Russian, I'm not going to sit there talking English. They won't understand me. I need to think about kids on this, an individual on the spectrum in the same way. If I don't recognize that, wow, social interactions are a foreign language to them, I'll just be doing things and not realize that they're not getting any of that, right? But if I can get that understanding to the general public more, then people can understand more that, oh, wait, this person doesn't get it that way, so I need to maybe in a more concrete way explain certain things to them, right? That can be a really good way to do that and help with that. Is that the last of the questions, or are there any other questions?
No, there's one more
Okay.
from Gabrielle again.
Yeah.
When a person likes to be alone, wait.
Yeah.
Oh, when a person likes to be alone, how do you push social interaction?
Okay. That's a great question, right? And part of that has to do, especially with kids on the spectrum, is sometimes understanding why they want to be alone. And it's certainly true that individuals on the spectrum often want a good bit of alone time, right? And we need to understand that as coming from the fact that literally when they're not alone, they can feel overloaded very quickly, right? Because they're constantly surrounded with all of these social interactions and all these things that get them stressed that they don't understand, right? So they pull back to being alone. And the best way to try to encourage them is what I like to think of as the exercise analogy, right? If I want to get stronger, I don't go and try to bench press 500 pounds and tear every muscle in my body. But I also don't lift a weight I can't feel at all. That's not going to get me any stronger, right? What do I need to do? I have to lift a weight that burns a little bit and just stay with that until I get stronger and that doesn't burn and I add a little bit more weight, right? That model is what we want to do with these kids, right? When they want to be alone, what we want to do is try to pick that thing that's just like a little weight, right? Looking to help push them just a little out of their comfort zone and maybe do an activity out with, one or two other kids or in a place that they like to go, right? To start that process, right? And doing that with them for a while. And then after they get used to that and they're comfortable with that, right, we can push them a little bit further, right? So it's really that goal of working to slowly push them a little bit out of their comfort zone, one step at a time, that can make a big difference and be really helpful. Are there any other questions? If not, I wanted to play this tape for everybody. Are we done? Are there any other questions?
It looks like that's it.
Okay, all right. So I wanted to play all for you a tape of Temple Grandin, who is actually a PhD animal behaviorist who is on the spectrum, and she's the one actually who I said before really described social interactions as a foreign language. But I think listening to her, look, she speaks from living it. So I would really like you to hear her so you can get a sense of what it's like to be on the spectrum. Uh-oh. Uh-oh. What's going on here? Oh, I don't know what happened. I am sorry. Oh, let's see if this.
For people living with autism, Temple Grandin is a hero, but her story goes way before that. And Temple has proven that autism can be turned into a gift.
I apologize. The talk I had, I don't know what happened to it. it disappeared for some reason. All right. Well, so this is what happens with telesessions, sometimes there's glitches that develop. But anyway, the really thing I wanted to do, Temple Grandin was really just speaking about, the things that we were talking about with everything, and how it's important. She really just talked about the idea that social interactions were a foreign language, that she pushed herself to go outside and to do things. And that's it. But anyway, look, thank you guys so much. And if you guys have any questions or things pop up that you didn't think about, you can definitely reach out, and I'm sure they can provide you my email or something like that. I'll be happy to email you guys answers to any questions you have or anything. All right? All right, take care. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. McGowan. I do other announcements. Televero will be at the Texas Counselor Association Conference, February 2nd through the 4th in Galveston. If you all are attending, we will definitely be there. We would love to meet you in person. And our third webinar will be presented on Wednesday, February 19th at noon. So it'll be at the same time, February 19th, and we would love to see you and your colleagues there. Thank you again for joining us today, and we hope you have a wonderful afternoon. And please feel free to contact us with any questions at clientservices@televerohealth.com. Thank you so much.